Chapter 16. It was mid July, hot and dry. We might have had second thoughts, but we worked until we wilted. It was us or the garden. How we longed for rain. The first welcome drops fell on hot sidewalks, the walks people said you could fry an egg on. Then, like a pushy guest, the rain stayed on and took over. Lying in bed one night, I watched the storm. Lightning tore the black sky. Thunder rumbled in and roared out. It sounded like war. I fell asleep imagining Jeff and Scott's father and the gardens all being bombed with rain. The next morning, I lifted a raincoat from a hook in the workroom and pulled on galoshes. Outside, I bent into the slashing rain and crossed the street. The wind lashed the branches of the Burt's giant elm. Just weeks before, the Sprouts had sat under that tree and planned how we would market our crops. Now the crops were awash in more water than the ground could hold. Perhaps the garden would survive, except for the lettuce. But there would be no picking or weeding soon. We'd have an enforced vacation. Glad of a lazy morning, I tidied the living room and sprawled on the sofa with a pile of magazines. I thumbed through one looking at pictures. One full page featured Fala, the president's little black Scotty. Another showed Bob Hope advertising Pepsodent. Then a headline leaped out: Floods ravage Midwest farms. We were not the only soggy ones. Millions of acres underwater peril to the nation's food supply. Department of Agriculture getting supplies to farmers for reseeding. I could just see Andy demanding that they replace our lettuce. The streets dried before the gardens did, at least enough for bike riding. I rode through the puddles, remembering Jeff and grateful for Billy. The tire, its tube patched and sealed, held up fine. I hadn't accounted for old age, the bike's age. The chain snapped when I jumped a curb. It would take a new chain or bicycle repair shop, Dad said later. That would mean a trip into the city, an impossibility except for emergencies, as if there weren't one. When, after 2 weeks away, the Sprouts got back to the garden, I was suddenly too busy to worry about a bike. We groaned when we saw what lay before us. Until then, we had merely picked. That day we would harvest. Beets, carrots, peas, beans, peppers, cucumbers, and turnips piled up on the workroom counter. We filled our baskets with paper sacks and set out in teams. Maria, Ellie, and I pulled the Flying Thunder, Jeff's old wagon, loaded down. The boys struck out on bikes, baskets jammed full. By now the outdoors felt like a steam kettle ready for new corn, but we pushed on, determined to sell everything. It took until 7 at night, and when we gathered at the garden again the next day, it seemed as if we had just been there. Scott whistled. And we thought yesterday was a long day. Were these all here then? Weeds towered through the plants and sprouted between the rows. Breezeless air, hot and muggy, made it our most miserable Saturday. Mud oozed between our bare toes, while we slapped at mosquitoes and decided where to begin. A weed slipped out of my hands when I pulled at it. I didn't want to be the prodder that day, the one to keep the gang going. We'll never get them all, I moaned. Sure we will, said Maria. The ground is soft. She gripped a weed and pulled straight up. See? Where's the weed basket? Here, said Ellie. She headed for Maria with the bushel basket. Suddenly she dropped it, screamed, and ran. Andy scrambled for the basket and turned it over and over. Nothing here. She probably saw a bug. I read Maria's thought in her look. Honestly, I left my trowel by a half-dug weed and stood up, intending to follow Ellie. In mid-step, I stopped, gasped, and caught myself at the elbows. Head still, neck stiff, I lowered my eyes. No one else moved. Then a sudden, slithering streak set them all in motion. Andy reached for a hoe, but Scott clutched his shoulder. Let it go, he said. It's just a garter snake. Harmless. They get into gardens sometimes. Don't tell Ellie that, said Andy. Tell her it's a Gobi desert snake and there'll never be one here again. Better tell her the truth, Scott spoke quietly. I'll do it. My mom's afraid of snakes too. He began to slow walk toward Ellie. My grateful look followed him. I unwound my arms, but my knees were shaking. The others tore into the weeds as if their lives depended on getting done and getting out. They talked like nervous first graders on opening day, and even Andy sneaked looks from side to side as he worked. Only Scott and Ellie, who had come back with him, seemed calm. Whatever he'd said to her, he should have said to all of us. Billy came shuffling by just as I was crossing the street with the hoe. You should have come earlier. You missed the excitement. I told him about the snake. He grinned. Yeah, I would have liked that. We could have used some help too. We had a jungle of weeds. Oh, no, you ain't roping me into that. I just thought, I know you believe in that stuff, being patriotic, bringing the men back and all. It probably will. Then why? I began but stopped. Billy had shoved his hands into his pockets and pressed his lips together like he was trying not to say more. You can tell me, I said. His words came out like a breath held too long. Ain't no garden in the world gonna bring my pop back. Your pop's gone? Been gone a long time, in a way. Somewheres, only he knows where. Somewheres in his own head. Except sometimes he's here, like when we fish or when he's telling me about the last war. But mostly he's gone. No garden's going to change that. We decided to take telephone orders to speed things up. I agreed we can use my number, and Andy's dad paid to call 55, added to our Chronicle ad. The next time we picked, lined empty sacks up on the workroom counter and labeled each sack with the customer's name and order. D. Martin, 2 cucumbers, 4 carrots, 1 onion. When we got back to the workroom after picking, we walked past the sacks like we were playing musical chairs and filled them directly from our baskets. When we had delivered the order sacks and peddled the remaining vegetables door to door, we still had time for a game of workup. We fed the quart jar, shook it, and cheered. We had survived drought, rain, sun, mosquitoes, bugs, one snake, and Theta Buell. Who said we couldn't do it? A week later, Scott came down with the mumps. His mom called just as we were heading over to the garden. Scott says he has orders for new potatoes, she said. We're really sorry. Mumps now? Said Andy as we trudged across the street, tools in tow. Poor guy. I had mumps in first grade, so had the rest of us. Scott's potatoes could be left in the ground for weeks, I knew. But he had promised the customers those tiny new ones, dug while still a pinkish red. I was beginning to feel like Tom Sawyer in reverse, doing more, not less. With Mrs. Bert's flowers, the tomatoes, the telephone orders, and extra work when one of the young sprouts missed a day. I barely had time to do my house chores and write to Jeff. I spent little time in our own garden now, leaving most of it up to Dad. Still, I was better off than Scott. I left a wide space between the potato fork and the plant as I dug, so I wouldn't slice into the potatoes and knelt to pull out the smallest ones. I counted out 6 to take to Scott. He should have them, even if he couldn't eat them. Covered with dirt, but too tired to wash, I delivered them to Scott's back door. His mother answered, her face drawn, her shoulders slumped. I thought she would be a pretty woman ordinarily. Scott's little sister in dirty rompers clung to her. 2 small boys tugged at her dress. I must have stared. 2 little faces, round as pumpkins, jaws swollen up to their temples. Mrs. Walker smiled a weak smile. Yes, she said. 3 mumps faces in one house. You boys get back in bed now. You have to stay down. To me, she said in the same breath, I hope you've had mumps. I have. I brought Scott the first potatoes out of the garden, and please tell him we have enough to fill his orders. I'll deliver them after supper. Bless you. He'll be so pleased, but I'm sure he won't let you see him. She pointed to her cheeks. I'll see if he has a message. While I waited on the porch, I looked at the garden that ran along the back of the house. It was obvious no one had worked on it since the rains. Weeds had shot up everywhere. A black garden hose, unneeded for weeks, lay neglected among the plants. Scott's words came back to me. My mom says it's the decent thing to do, he had said when I asked for volunteers. 100 years ago, it seemed. Their garden would soon be overgrown. Someone had to do the decent thing for them now. Mrs. Walker returned with a note. In scraggly letters it said, Thanks, Treese. You're all right. Scott. The Walker's garden is small, I said to Mother later in the kitchen. We could do it in half the time we do the Berts if everyone helped. I snapped the ends off the string beans from the day's picking. But I've pushed the sprouts pretty hard. Mother held up her cooking spoon. Maybe you can pull them this time. Pull them. It came up again at supper. You mean offer them something they can't resist? I don't have money to pay them. I'm sure Mrs. Walker doesn't either. And Charlie Sweet has already donated ice cream cones once, Mother said. She smiled as she passed the beans to Dad. Dad stopped his fork between his plate and his mouth. Ice cream! We haven't had that ice cream freezer out in ages. I was on the phone before the table was cleared. The promise of homemade ice cream canceled any other plans. Every sprout except Scott crowded onto our small back porch with my mother and Dad on Sunday afternoon. They took turns turning the handle of the freezer and feeding it ice and salt. When the handle would barely move, Dad pronounced the ice cream done. Hot diggity, said Andy. Mother removed the lid and the paddle. She scraped the paddle, leaving some of the sweet stuff on it for taste. Replacing the lid, she said, "It has to sit in the tub for an hour or so. What would you like to do while you wait?" She glanced at me. "Let's go see Scott," I said. "We can take flowers from Mrs. Bird's yard." "Boys don't like flowers," said Andy. "Boys' mothers do," said Mother. Since the flowers were for Scott's mothers, the boys helped pick them. Then Ellie, Andy, Maria, and I cut through the alley and trooped over to Scott's. Andy stuck his hand out with the flowers and made the presentation speech to Mrs. Walker. "For you, from us." "Oh, you kids, thank you. I'm afraid Scott's asleep. I'll tell him you stopped by." As she closed the screen door, I saw a smile on her face that hadn't been there before. She really was pretty. The Walkers' garden filled their small backyard from door to alley. As we filed down the back path, I leaned over a tomato plant to pull a weed. "Look at all these," I said. I caught Andy's glance and circled the air with my finger, nodding toward the other kids. "Hey, this is right up our alley," said Andy. He bent over the next row. "Well, Scott's alley." Andy wouldn't miss a chance to clown. It always worked. "Tell you what, everybody take a row. First one done gets double ice cream," he called. I hoped the ice cream would hold out. It did. There was even enough to take some back over to Scott after Andy got the double portion, proving himself a better weed puller than he had ever let us know. Billy had disappeared again. A letter came back from Jeff with the answers to my questions. "Your friend is right, Teresa. Those lightnings have saved my skin a time or two. We're lucky to have them. Don't worry about me, Squirt. I've got a good bird, and Billy's P-38s are there. About your friend, when people act like they want trouble, it's often because they've already got trouble. Billy's a fighter, sounds like. Nothing wrong with that if you know what's worth fighting for. Love, Jeff."